All right, I started recording. This is, we officially started. And Farouzan, would you like to officially introduce Professor Coletta to the group?
Of course, it's my pleasure. So our guest today is Dr. Vince Coletta. Dr. Coletta is a professor of physics at Loyola Marymount University. He's the author of College Physics and Thinking in Physics. This is mine. And Dr. Coletta is very active in physics education research. And his focus is on improving conceptual understanding and problem-solving skills in his students. His research involves looking at FCI, normalized gains, scientific reasoning ability, and barriers to conceptual understanding. And we have invited Dr. Coletta to speak to us today and help us start our own journey of collecting and analyzing data on two-year college physics students. Welcome, Dr. Coletta.
Thank you, Farouzan, and it's good to see you again after all these years. Farouzan and I were colleagues at LMU a number of years ago, and I always love talking to her. And I'm glad to see that she's working on this project. Let me see if I can share my screen. My experience in Zoom is not great. I was on leave for a while, and I've only had one semester of Zoom experience with a class. I think I want to share my screen. I think this is the one. Okay, can you guys see this PowerPoint?
Yes.
Okay, great. So my email is here in case you have some questions or discussion you want afterwards. I usually start before I start with a little classical music, but we'll bypass that since we've already started. And let me just briefly describe my teaching situation at LMU. It is a very diverse population, both ethnically, culturally, and intellectually. So that means there's a huge range of abilities among my students. I teach typically 2 classes per semester, and I teach typically the algebra-based course to life science students primarily, classes of 20 to 30 students, 2/3 of whom are female typically. And we meet 3 times a week, each time for 90 minutes, once per concepts. And so I call these concept classes, and there'll be a lot of discussion and interaction, which I'll try to incorporate into my talk today, a little taste of that. And then there's one class for problem solving, in which students present problems, and then one for lab. So 4 parts to my talk today. I hope I get through most, if not all of this. The first, which is the theme of this talk, concept inventories, and then closely related to that is normalized gains. And then I want to go on to discuss Lawson's test of scientific reasoning, and then recent claims disparaging the use of normalized gain. I've been working hard to dispute those claims that there's problems with normalized gain. I don't believe there are, and we should continue to use it, and I'll try to present a little of that. And then finally, I'll try to look at all of the other factors. Gender is one of them, and there's others as well, many others. So let's get started, and please feel free to interrupt me at any time if you have a question. Okay.
We'll be moderating, and if anybody wants to display anything in the chat, we'll convey the questions also. Thank you, Professor Coletta.
Okay, so the original concept inventory was the force concept inventories, still the most widely used, and it tested understanding of basic concepts in mechanics. This was developed by Effectivenes and his group at Arizona State in 1992. Since then, there have been a number of others. I'll just mention a couple. The FCME is an alternative to FCI. I still prefer the FCI, the original. And then for other courses, of course, you'd have to measure other things. So the CSEM, Conceptual Survey of Electricity and Magnetism, is a more recent addition. And typically all of these are administered in the same way at the beginning and end of the course. used to determine just how much was learned by the students during the course. Just to give you, how many of you are familiar with the FCI? Just please raise your hand if you are. Okay, most but not all. I'll just give you a sample question. A stone is dropped from the roof of a single-story building to the surface of the earth. And which is the correct answer? And we'll do this, see if I can do a poll.
Which is maximum speed.
Where is the polling?
At the bottom, next to share the screen share.
Okay. I don't see. We can do it with hands.
Okay, well, I can insert something.
Can you initiate the poll?
I am trying. I'm also having a little bit of trouble.
Okay. Technical problems. Okay, well, let me just read this question quickly, since most of you are familiar. A stone is dropped from the roof of a single-story building. A, it reaches a maximum speed quite soon after release and then falls at constant speed thereafter. B, it speeds up as it falls because the gravitational attraction gets considerably stronger as the stone gets closer to the earth. C, oh, I see we're polling now. C, it speeds up because of an almost constant force of gravity acting upon it. D, it falls because of the natural tendency of all objects to rest on the surface of the earth. Or E, falls because of the combined effects of the force of gravity pushing it downward and the force of the air pushing it downward. Okay, so I see we have some answers, only a few, only 3 of 13. Please answer. This is, of course, anonymous. In class, I use clickers to do the same thing. So please answer one of these.
Because I launched the poll, I cannot answer. And I think, Professor Coletta, you can also not answer. So there'll be 2.
Oh, so there's only 11. I've got 10 of 11. Okay, let's end it because I don't want to take too long with this. And I'll share the results. Okay, so 70% of you said C, and that is the correct answer. A is not correct. Terminal velocity would happen only falling from a much greater height. But the way that I would use this in class, now this is not one of my class questions because this is my evaluation question. But if this were an in-class question, I would look for answers to this, and then I would pair students up and have them discuss their answers, and then I would poll them again, and maybe even 3 times. Till we got to a more consistent answer. And in that way, instead of just giving the answer, that is not a good interactive method, just to poll people, give them the correct answer. It just zips right through them. They need to engage.
Like peer instruction by Professor Mazur.
Yes, my methods are very similar to Professor Mazur, peer instruction. I developed it before I knew about his, and I'll tell you how that sort of led to my research. Okay, so if you simply look at your pre-scores and post-scores, the pre-scores range from, well, in this case, 5 up to over 20, and the post-scores range from 10 to 30. So they definitely improve, but they're very much correlated, pre-score and post-score. So how do you compare students with different starting points? And the way you do is, I think, a brilliant invention of Richard Haight that he initiated in 1998. He defined what's called the normalized gain. It's defined as the increase in score divided by the maximum possible increase. So it's the fraction of questions that you didn't already know that you learned compared to the total number that you didn't know. It's a measure of how much you learn. It's a very effective one. So now a gain of 0.5 could mean that you're halfway between your starting point and a perfect score. So that could mean 20 to 60%, 40 to 70%, 60 to 80%. Very different set of scores, but those would all give the same normalized gain. Now, contrary to some people's belief, and some people actually quote my early paper to support this belief, G is not correlated with pre-score. That's the beauty of it, at least when other variables are taken into account. And I'll get back to that a little bit later. So it's a beautiful way of comparing both individuals and classes that have very different pre-scores. Now, traditional versus IE courses. In 1998, Hake also published the results of a survey of gains in 62 introductory physics courses. He showed that gains in traditional courses were consistently low, but gains were substantially better in classes using active learning, and he coined the term interactive engagement, abbreviated IE. The average gain that he found for traditional classes was only 0.23. The average gain in IE classes was 0.48. This is an enormous difference. And so it was very convincing that, you know, if you're teaching traditionally, you ought to be changing that. Also published in 1998 was an article in Physics Today by Joe Reddish. He's professor at the University of Maryland, very active in physics education, and he showed some graphs of distribution of gains for traditional classes. Again, these are centered on 0.2, although there's a range. And then tutorial, which was sort of an intermediate, not a fully interactive engagement. And then what he called workshop physics, where the center of the distribution was over 0.4. So again, a tremendous difference between the IE course and the traditional course. Now, in 1995, I attended for the first time in a number of years an APT meeting. It was at my alma mater, Notre Dame. And frankly, I went there to promote the textbook I had just written and also to catch up with old friends. But then that meeting was filled with discussion of the FCI. And I saw it for the first time. I looked at it. I was certain my students would do well on it. After all, these questions were very simple, and you know, I gave them a great course. Then when I got back to LMU and gave the FCI to my students, I was shocked. My students' gains were comparable to those in other traditional courses. I don't remember what exactly they were, but around 0.2. I was not using interactive engagement methods. After 25 years of teaching, I decided I had to radically change my method, and I began to do so. And that was an evolution over a number of years. So I had a teaching reform, and I did a number of things in this reform, including developing a classroom. We reoriented a traditional type classroom to something that would be more conducive to interaction and discussion between pairs of students. And so this is the layout. These are 8 tables holding a maximum of 32 students, 4 per table, and opposite each other across the table would be students that were paired up. So this was helpful in itself, but then there were a lot of changes in my methods to introduce conceptual questions and all the other things that I do now. But then along in 1997, Professor Mazur published his book, Peer Instruction, describing his IE methods. His methods were actually very similar to what I was already doing, but his gains were much higher. His average gain was about a 0.6. Mine was about a 0.4. I found this very disturbing and made me wonder why. Now, he's a Harvard professor, so I could have just stopped there. But it occurred to me it might be because he had an elite population. Perhaps the difference was due to a greater ability of Harvard students to learn physics. And by the way, Eric Mazur was very gracious in sharing data with me for several years. But when I thought about this, I thought, well, there needs to be a method of measuring just what my students' abilities were. And it turns out there was a test that was already developed by Anton Lawson. He called it a classroom test of scientific reasoning ability. And that sounded perfect to me. And I began to give this test to my students. And Jeff Phillips, my colleague at LMU, also did. And we found that there was a very strong correlation between scientific reasoning ability and normalized gain. So the higher the scientific reasoning ability, independent of where they started out in terms of knowledge. So it wasn't a matter of pre-knowledge versus post-knowledge, because the gain sort of took away the pre-knowledge thing. But it was a matter of their ability to learn as measured by the Lawson test. Let me give you an example of Lawson question. And I guess we can do this again as a little a break to, oh, I can start a poll now. I'm going to relaunch polling. Okay, so here's a new poll. There's two related questions. That's the way the Lawson test works. It's showing some masses hanging from strings, string 1, 2, and 3, and the masses are either 5 or 10, and you can see there's different lengths. Suppose you want to find out whether the length of the string has an effect on the time it takes to swing back and forth. Which strings would you use to find out? A, only one string, B, all 3, C, 2 and 3, D, 1 and 3, or E, 1 and 2. Okay, so please answer that. And then the follow-up question, so I ask you can take a look at that after you finish answering this.
Yeah, we should end the poll.
What?
I have just ended the poll. Do you mind? Even though it says FCI sample question at the top, it's just about the question with 5 options. And Professor, 73% answered letter E for the first question.
Yes, I was going to share this with everybody. Can you see it now, the poll results? Yeah, and let's see, what is the correct answer? E is the correct answer, okay? So 3/4 of the class got that. And then the reason for that, and I'm going to move along because we've got a lot to cover. And what's the reason? Because you must use the longest strings? No. You must compare strings with both light and heavy weights? No. C is the correct answer here. Only the length's different. So it's controlling variables. Only the lengths vary between 1 and 2, and that's the variable you want to investigate. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So that's an example. There's 24 Lawson questions, and typically it will take about a half an hour. And let me stress one other thing. It's very important to maintain the security of these tests, especially if you give a little bit of extra credit for them. Now, I give a Lawson test at the beginning of the course. There's no credit for that. I give the FCI at the beginning and at the end. I give a little bit of extra credit at the end. Otherwise, students tend to not take it seriously. And so for that reason, I'm very careful about security. I only give this in a live setting, and I count the number of tests, make sure I get them all back. So it becomes very difficult for students to, I suppose somebody could take pictures of it, but I think I would see that in a small classroom. So it's pretty secure, and I encourage you, if you do these things, to try to maintain that level of security. So here's some results. Jeff Steiner is a valued colleague of mine. He's a high school teacher, And this is some of his most recent results. He's teaching currently at Arizona School for the Arts, and he has phenomenal gains. And we're still wondering about this. We think it has something to do with the students he gets. Even in above and beyond the Lawson scores, his gains are, even at the low end, are pretty high, 0.4. And you notice this curve flattens pretty much until you get 70, and that's where it takes off. And at that point, you start getting up to 0.6 or more. So that's his results. Jeff and I published a number of papers together. He's very generously shared results. But it turns out SAT scores work just about as well. And this is even more impressive. This was from his previous teaching experience at Edward Little High School in Maine. He moved from Maine to Arizona. And this was a study of his FCI gains versus SAT scores. Now, he had an enormous range, and the reason was he had some classes that were honors classes, and that would be all the classes up in here. And for that reason, we see just a tremendous spread. So down around, and by the way, his results at Edward Little, very diverse population, were very similar to the results we got at LMU. I present his results because I think they're the clearest. Down at the lowest end of 1,000 or less SAT score, gains of 0.3. Interactive still, but not all that great. And at the upper end, 0.6, 0.7, pushing towards 0.8 when you get, and this sort of explains the Harvard results, because wouldn't your Harvard students all have SATs of probably 1,300, 1,400 or more? So now, in recent years, there's been a number of complaints about the normalized gain, and I was very upset when I read these papers, because some of my research was actually used to support the arguments. Nissen did this in a Phys Rev paper in 2008, claimed that G is pre-score biased. And remember, I said it's independent of pre-score. But in my initial paper in 2005, I did show that there was a correlation between gain and pre-score. But that led me to examine the Lawson test, and I found that the apparent correlation was due not to pre-score itself, but to scientific reasoning ability, which is itself correlated with pre-score. So through the scientific reasoning ability, there will be an apparent correlation. But if you do a multivariable correlation study, you find out that pre-score is not a factor. Mm-hmm. So in February 2020, Steiner and I published once again a paper in Phys Rev refuting those claims, I think pretty thoroughly. And then right after that, along comes Burkholder, who I worked with briefly on developing this paper, and then we had a parting of the ways because it turns out he didn't like normalized gain. And in this new paper, which came out in June of 2020, he agreed that it's not pre-score bias, but he claimed that multivariable regression should be used instead of normalized gain. And the reason was that these normalized class gains are not normally distributed. And he presented an argument which was purely theoretical, no data at all, but claiming they're just not, and here's the reason why. I found his reasoning very difficult to follow, but I had a lot of data, and so I started collecting this, and here's what I found. For the first 100, I haven't published this yet, so you're the first people that I'm presenting this to. Look at these two curves. But of course, I bend the data over a range of numbers. And so the actual data from these 125 classes is the blue curve. And a normal distribution is the red curve. Well, that's pretty damn close. And there's actually theoretical methods for deciding whether something is a normal distribution or not. My colleague David Meltzer from Arizona State is working on this with me, and he concludes based on this method, which I've never used, yes, this is definitely a normal distribution, but I think you can see it already. So this demonstrates that Burkholder's claim is wrong. Now we're going beyond this because David is really a very thorough researcher. I don't know how any of you know David Meltzer? He goes to many, he's been one of the people that introduced me to PER many years ago, and I've consulted him often, but now we're working together on a paper for the first time to respond to Burkholder's claim, and this is part of our data. Then we got data from Phys-Port. Now the only problem with the data from Phys-Port, it of course did not have Lawson scores or SAT scores or anything we can compare. And so, we, everything was mixed together. It did distinguish IE from traditional, but that was, and there were other things that were distinguished, including class size, which turns out not to matter at all. So we looked at our data. I won't show you that yet because we're still working on it, but it appears to be kind of like a double normalized gain. And our supposition at this point, working hypothesis, we're still working on, is that they're really an overlay of two normalized gains for those with low Lawson scores, if we have them, and those for higher Lawson scores. And it sort of gives us this humpback thing. Still looks kind of normal, but with two peaks. So hopefully we'll get that straightened out. We're still right in the middle of that.
That's with all the Phys-Port data.
Yes, that's 800 classes from Phys-Port. And I am going to try to urge Phys-Port to start asking for other data that really informs this. So using normalized gain to assess teaching effectiveness, I would say we can and should use normalized gain, not normalized change, not effect size, not multivariable regression, which nothing wrong with that, but it's too complicated for most people to want to use. However, the interpretation of the results relies on knowing something about the student's reasoning level, either Lawson or SAT scores, or maybe other measures that we haven't found. So I've got a polling question again. Does a G of 0.3 mean your course is not very effective? Let's say you have an IE course. Let's say you have a G of 0.3. Does it mean it's not very effective? Yes, no, or it depends? Okay. I'm going to end the polling here and share the results. And everybody agrees. It depends, and that's the correct answer. So you can't just give an FCI score. My follow-up question, I think everybody will get this because everybody got the last one. Does a G of 0.5 mean your course is very effective? And of course, the right answer to that is it depends. So if you have a 0.3 and your average SAT score in your class is 1,000, I'd say that's pretty effective. But if your G is 0.5 and your average SAT score is 1,400, I would say, well, it's not bad, but it's not all that effective. Probably ought to be 0.6 or 0.7. So I'm just trying to make the point of needing an additional measure to interpret.
So Professor Coletta, one of the questions is exactly that. It depends on what? Yeah.
What?
That it depends. The correct answer here is it depends.
Yes.
Depends on a lot of factors, such as what?
Such as what the average reasoning ability of students in your class is as measured either by the Lawson test or by SAT scores. It depends on that. to be able to interpret that. And that's what I want to encourage people to start doing.
I would also say that error bars, statistical error bars, and the number of people in the sample. I don't know. I think
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, you can certainly do that. Get your standard error, and if you want to. But trust me, if you have even 15 or 20 students, that's enough to have meaningful results. And with classes that size, they will vary a little bit from semester to semester due to, as you say, statistical variations, but you can measure standard error and see what the range is. I'll show that in an upcoming. But 2-year college data is desperately needed. FCI data for 2-year colleges is lacking. And I know that because Farouzan told me that. So,
Could I interrupt a second? There was
Yeah.
some questions in the chat about this connection between SAT scores and scientific reasoning. Is that correlation or causation?
well, one never knows, of course. Correlation is not causation. I would lean pretty hard towards causation, that this is some kind of a measure of students' ability to learn. And it doesn't matter whether it's scientific reasoning ability or just SAT scores. As I showed you in some of those previous graphs from Jeff Steiner, it's the same thing. Of course, there's never proof, the smoking caused cancer. Well, a lot of correlational studies were done and it was correlational. But yes, I would say smoking does cause cancer. And I would say that reasoning ability, and it makes sense, intuitive sense. If you've got somebody that is just smarter for whatever reason, whether it's genetic or background or education, whatever the reasoning may be, if their reasoning ability is stronger, they're going to learn more in your class.
So Theo, just before the talk started, we were talking to Professor Coletta. I think you weren't here right there and then, but he was mentioning the fact that if we don't have the Lawson test, but if we have SAT scores, then maybe one could work with the other in place of the other to detect preparedness and reasoning abilities. But then we mentioned that probably we don't have our community colleges, our 2-year colleges don't require SATs for our students. So we also would have trouble getting the SAT scores probably.
Could I ask for a show of hands, how many would have access to SAT scores of your students? Any?
Probably.
I wouldn't have access. I'm still not convinced that SAT scores really tell you about student learning, so to speak. Unless you engage every student to practice the SAT and to get better at it, then you could see how you could assess their learning from the SAT. But I wouldn't necessarily use the SAT as the way, I guess I'm not convinced to use it the way you're using it.
Let me just go back
Yes.
for a moment to one of these slides. Can you see this?
Yep.
Can you see this slide?
Yes.
Yes, we can see the graph.
Isn't that kind of convincing that if you have a class with a very high SAT around 1300, you're much more likely. Now, it's not completely determinative. There's a scatter here, even among these students, but if you have an SAT of 1,000 versus 1,300, there's a tremendous difference.
We have another question here, Christopher.
Yes.
Just a question and a comment. My question is, or my comment is that there seems to be a lot of issues with the SAT as of now. There is talk, at least here in Colorado, of the fact that they may stop accepting it entirely. Because there's too many racial discrepancies and too many racial and gender discrepancies to make the test a valid remark to whether a student can succeed in college. The other thing I would want to say is that this correlation of of SATs and FCI scores, are we talking also, even in this pandemic year, there are quite a few students who haven't taken the SAT and are not going to. So how is that going to affect your data?
Well, in fact, I haven't been doing much with SAT data lately. I've been out of operation for a year and a half. I was on sabbatical. I had another issue that kept me out. So I don't have any real recent data. So I can't really address that. And when I was teaching in the spring was second semester physics. So I didn't do any of this assessment stuff with them. But yeah, you raise an interesting point about not using the SAT. You raise the issue of gender. I'm going to address that in just a minute.
And socioeconomic status. Another professor was mentioning that SATs are performance is correlated with socioeconomic status as well.
Thank you, Glenn.
Yeah,
I was just going to say that.
And socioeconomic status, therefore, may be related to learning. And so the question is, what can we do about this?
Yeah.
So first of all, I would hope that you could help change the situation by providing data. If you would just give the Lawson test along with FCI pre and post, that would be very valuable to those of us that are doing the research. And if you wanted to join in our efforts to do research, such as Jeff Snyder did from Maine and Arizona, that would be great. But I want to talk now about some other factors that can affect learning. And certainly gender is one of these. And sleep deprivation is another. Anxiety is another. These are all things that I have come to address in recent years in my own teaching. So I developed what I call Thinking in Physics and wrote a book for instructors only. It's available free of charge from Pearson. Was published in 2014, and then I also have a website for students and instructors. And it's designed to address gender differences and to try to develop reasoning and problem-solving abilities along with an understanding of physics. So we're not saying that a person who is starting out with a weaker reasoning ability as measured on the Lawson test has to stay there. Now, I'm not saying that these things are easy to change, but I have done pre and post testing on the Lawson test, and it does improve to the extent that we're able to provide some methods of improving that. And let me just show you the main one I wanted to address, because this is the bulk of our students, was the gender gap. And, you know, other people had studied this. I had ignored this because I refused to believe that my female students were at any disadvantage at all. Therefore, I never looked at the data, male versus female, until I did around, I don't know, 2011 or so. I looked at, and this was prior to my developing the new pedagogy, the further development of interactive engagement, and I was shocked at the difference. This is much larger than the typical difference that you observe in interactive classes. So
Professor Coletta,
yes.
Could you full screen your presentation?
Oh, yes.
Again?
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you for asking, Chris.
Yeah, thank you for asking. My students always have to remind me to do something I should have done. So I appreciate anyone doing that. So look at that, 0.3 to over 0.5. Why is that? I was convinced I wasn't doing anything. It was nothing in my teaching. I truly believed it was something, though, in the background that affected female learning, and it had to be addressed. So I made a transition from 2007 to 2011. It got better, and it actually got better for both males and females, but the gap got a little smaller. And then by 2012 to 2015, it got quite a bit smaller. Now, it didn't disappear, but much better than 0.3 to 0.5. It's now over 0.5 to just over 0.6. And so it is something that you can do. So I questioned myself, why is there a gender gap? Some people started saying, oh, there's a gender gap because there's a gender bias in the test. Well, frankly, I found that to be BS, and it's never been authenticated. But there are a number of things that contribute to it, including stereotype threat, which just by virtue of being in a physics class can be brought out. There's also test anxiety, which female students tend to suffer from more than male. There's also interest. Males on the average tend to have greater interest in physics coming in. There's also educational background and resistance to change. I found that female students were a little more resistant to change than male students. So what did I do to try to reduce the gender gap? Well, I started with something that was developed by CU a number of years ago. It's a self-affirmation exercise, which is given without explanation the first day of class to address stereotype threat. And it's just to sort of affirm values. And it's a mystery to me why this seems to help, but it does. I also started changing the things I did and making them more transparent. A detailed study guide explaining the unusual features of my course. I continued with assessment, not only a physics background and scientific reasoning, but assessment of impulsiveness, a survey of attitudes, confidence, anxiety. I started a thinking journal in which all students share with me a box folder, and whenever I submit questions to them, prompts, they respond by an entry, thinking journal number 1, 2, 3. There's about 5 or 6 during the semester to encourage metacognition, to encourage them to think about thinking. The first one is just to get to know them. So I asked, tell me something about yourself. That in itself can be interesting. And then I follow that with a 15-minute interview. And I think this is one of the most important things that I do. And I got this from attending an AAPT meeting. And I remember it was a woman from the East Coast who was so excited about this approach. She was just bubbling over to explain to people how effective it was if you interview your students. Now, she did 30-minute interviews, and I didn't feel that I had that much time, so I adapted this to 15-minute interview with each student during the first week of classes. And I tell them, this is just so you get to know me and you feel comfortable to coming into class or to coming on to Zoom, whatever. I think this is one of the major things that made a difference, along with the thinking journal. Collaborative classwork, I continue to do that. Low stakes testing initially to reduce anxiety. I took that to a whole new level during my online course, and I'll share this with you, although some people probably find this problematic. I discovered from my colleagues that about 10% of the students who took their courses were cheating with online exams, and they had no way of preventing this. To me, this is totally unacceptable not because of the students getting something for nothing, but because of the other students who were honest not getting that same good grade just because they were honest and took the test. So I decided there will be no tests in this online course. There will be no tests that will test your understanding and that will determine your grade. So I did a number of other things. I did tests to self-assess their understanding. I did a number of things that were involved in engagement and participation. And so there were a number of things I could measure. And my feeling is that they learned about as much. Shockingly, they learned about as much. And one of the big outgrowths of this is anxiety was completely eliminated. Where's the anxiety? There's no test to be anxious about. It's just a matter of participating. I gave a lot more A's than usual, but certainly not all. There were still a couple of F's, a couple of D's. And then developing interest in physics any way we can, and gains and extra credit to help develop reasoning ability, and other things. So the assessment of the stereotype threat, which is a really interesting thing, was developed at University of Colorado in 2010, and I began adapting it. I got their permission to use it. And it simply asks questions like, what are the things you value? The 2 or 3 things you value the most? Is it religion and music, or is it athletics and independence, whatever it is? And this was just to get them to relate to something different. And there's a number of these questions. The study guide, I think, was also extremely important because I never described enough of what I do to my students, the reasons for what I do. And so I tried to present the reasons and the evidence that it worked so that they would be more open to the weird stuff that I do in my courses, and offering advice on what and how to study, how to utilize the resources that I provide, and even quotes from former students. And I remind them periodically to reread the study guide. And then assessment. Of course, the forced concept inventory and the Lawson test, the SAT, but also I began surveying attitudes, beliefs, confidence, anxiety, measuring impulsiveness. A guy named Reuven Feuerstein from Israel developed this thing that I adapted. It's Feuerstein dots, and it measures attention to detail. How impulsive are you? Connect the dots. Fluid intelligence, Raven's matrices. Anybody ever heard of Raven's matrices? This is one of the oldest measures of IQ, and you can measure this. And then the thinking journal, which encourages reflection. And I respond to these and interact to these when they put something important in their thing. And then the interviews, of course. This helps with reducing anxiety, I think. And I share some assessment results with them. I'll tell them, frankly, you know, your FCI pre-score, I won't call it FCI, but your, you know, indication is that you didn't learn much from high school physics, so you're going to have a challenge. Or, you know, you did really well. This may not be as much of a challenge for you as some other people. And trying to identify students and setting up special tutoring for students that are more at risk. So addressing this problem of this very diverse group. The collaborative coursework and separate problem solving classes and the labs that are coordinated with this. The labs, by the way, are ungraded, but they stress concepts, and they're also followed by ungraded lab concept quizzes to see if they got anything out of the lab. Online solutions. I used to use, well, I definitely used the Polya method of the Polya steps of problem solving. I won't go through that here, but that can be very effective. The frequent testing. I give some extra credit if they correct their mistakes on a test. They can earn 25% of the missed points, so not all is lost just from the test results. Developing interest. So I try to make some of the questions at least interesting. And at the end of the course, I ask students to present a 5-minute YouTube video they created on any topic of interest to the group that physics applies to. And since physics applies to almost everything, there's plenty of things that they can do. And then the games. These are on the TIP website. The Kickbox game, which was created by Matthew Peterson of the Mind Research Institute. He graciously shared this with me. It no longer works on the website because, unfortunately, Flash has been discontinued. So I'm in contact with him. I just discovered that it's not working. The games that the students find are enjoyable, but they're very challenging. And they make heavy demands on working memory. So let me stop there and see if there's any questions. And I have a few other examples I can go to, but I want to, hopefully I haven't raced through this too fast. Are there any questions about any of this?
Thank you, Professor Coletta. be moderating the questions. Frozen too, if you want to help. We are, and if anybody wants to speak up, go ahead. If you want to post anything in the chat, we'll convey your question.
Let me just stress once again, what gives me hope and the ability, I've always wanted to measure things. Physicists want to measure things. And I was always frustrated by the fact for the first 25 years of my teaching, I had no way of knowing how my students were doing. I thought they were doing pretty well. I developed a textbook to try to improve this, but there's no way of really knowing. But once the concept inventories were developed, all of a sudden there is a way of knowing. And one can then try different things. And you can see, do they work or don't they work? I think it's just a very powerful thing for us to allow us to develop as teachers. Well, if there are no questions, I'll just give you a couple examples of my concept questions that I often ask during class. Suppose you're hiking in the mountains during a thunderstorm. Would it be safe to get inside an abandoned car? Yes or no? If you say yes, just raise your hand. Your hand is down.
I'm staying inside the car.
How many are getting inside that car? I'm getting inside the car because it's you're surrounded by metal and it's like a Faraday cage. So this is one of the questions I ask. And then I show how many of you have ever been in a plane struck by lightning? I know I have. I had no idea what it was. But did it bother us? No. And there's actually a YouTube video. So I show this video afterwards. Here's a guy, a photograph of this guy in an Edsel being tested with lightning striking. And you can see the lightning is going through the car to the ground. He has a frown on his face, but I don't think he's affected. And this is a beautiful video on YouTube showing lightning striking a plane, and the plane just keeps on going. Now, here's another question, and this is a harder one. You're hiking in the mountains during a thunderstorm. Which of the following would be safest on flat open ground? Stretch your body out flat, spread eagle, or crouch down with your feet close together? Don't feel bad if you don't know the question of this. I've asked many physicists this question, and most don't know it because they don't know enough about lightning. How many say A? How many say B? Okay, and how many say you have no idea? I didn't have that up here. The correct answer is B. And most people do answer A. I was pleased to see most of you answered B. Can anyone tell me what the reason is that B is correct?
Does it have to do with establishing a potential difference?
Absolutely, excellent. It has to do with that and the fact that lightning doesn't just strike and go straight down to the earth. It flows along the ground, and so it becomes like a wire with current flowing out. And if you stretch out, you've got different points at different voltages. So
I immediately thought of the analogy of the bird sitting on the power line.
Yeah, that's great.
That's what came to mind first.
I guarantee you most of your students won't get the answer.
I read a story once that I keep telling in class about cows standing in different directions next to a tree when they get hit by lightning. So the ones that have head or tail next to the tree and stretching radially outward get hit more than the ones that's
Oh.
the other way.
I hadn't heard that. Of course, one of my questions is, should you stand next to a tree? And the answer is no.
But the cows seem to be doing that. So.
Actually, I don't do this, but one of my friends, well, I'm running out of time, so I won't do that. So this shows an example of lightning strikes and what happens to cattle because they can't crouch down with their feet together. Just a quick example of some of the group projects. The Grand Jeté is one of them. I don't know if any of you know that ballet move where the ballerina seems to be floating. The physics of that is really interesting. And there's physics of all sorts of things. I had a student come up with, he was a fly caster and he wanted to study the physics. It's whatever they want to study, and it's really diverse. And then the kickbox games, unfortunately, you can't see them right now because Flash is gone and I'm working on getting them back. But this is a picture of it. It's a real cool game that students enjoy playing, and it really does help develop working memory. Here's a real easy one. You position this reflectors. What? I heard something, but do we have to stop right now?
We don't have any specific limit, but yes, we are at 5 o'clock. If you want to conclude the idea.
Yeah, I'll finish up really quickly. If you move this around, most people can see quickly. Move this reflector over here, the laser beam will hit, get this out of the way, the penguin can get around its path. But what if you have this? Oh my God, this is an advanced one. I couldn't do this offhand. It would take me a good while, but my students get to the point where they can. This develops their working memory, and they only get so many chances, so it can't just be trial and error. This is very effective. This is the connect the dots that I mentioned, that Iota Reuven Feuerstein's, that trying to get these shapes by seeing these shapes, and they get progressively harder and harder.
Wow.
Okay, so that completes my presentation. Thank you for your attention. And again, I hope you will use the FCI as well as the Lawson test or SAT scores. And I really hope you'll share these with me. And I hope this will be useful for you in developing your NSF project.
I do have one quick question, if I may.
Sure.
For what value of n, with n being the number of students in a class, for what value of n do our data become useful? My classes are typically capped at 24.
Right.
Over
That's
the
very
past
useful.
years, I've had between 15 and 20.
Who was here?
So,
I have between 15 and 30. So very similar years, and they're all, those are all good numbers. I would say only if you get down to really small numbers. My summer school classes are even smaller. They might be only 10. Now there it starts to get borderline. You get down to 5, I would say, well, that's, you're not seeing much. But 15, did you say 15 to 20?
yes.
Yeah, I'd say all of those are good. Now, are they as good as 100? Probably not. You're going to have a much greater standard error, but it's certainly good enough to see results. And over time and multiple classes, you can see how this changes.
Thank you. We have used both FCI and the Lawson test before, and I really, really, really love the Lawson test. I think,
that's fantastic. Can you share your data with me?
well, we weren't allowed to analyze it.
You weren't allowed to analyze it.
Yes, because what we were doing, we were giving it to students in physics, astronomy, chemistry, biology, and geology. And we had students who were taking more than one of those courses at the same time. And so the department chair at the time, who is not my department chair now, pulled the plug on the project because they thought that the repetition was somehow harmful. Even though I was controlling for that, I was eliminating the students who were doing it twice.
Yeah.
So the data were taken away from me, and I don't know whatever became of it.
Oh, that's horrible. That's department chairs for you. That can be a bad thing. So hopefully now with the new department chair, that won't happen. Maybe you can get some official.
You've got me interested in trying it again, at least for the courses that I'm responsible for. And I actually made contact with Lawson, and we had some very wonderful discussions.
He's a great guy. I first contacted him when I became aware of his test, and I asked if I could reproduce it in my first PER paper in 2005. And he said, well, I don't know why you'd want to do that, as though nobody would be interested in this.
I think that's where I first learned of it.
Oh, I see. Okay.
I think, if memory serves me.
Yeah, it was not, people were not aware of it. It was my colleague, actually, Jeff Phillips, that alerted me to it. I had never heard of it, but somehow he was aware of it and let me know, and then I tried it, and it took off from there.
In my department, we try to do that, and we got an enormous amount of pushback from all the other faculty. They just didn't want to hear about it. I showed it to them, and they told me, "Oh, those are silly questions. It's too simple," and they just refused to do it because we were just about to talk about outcomes and things like that. And I said, "Why don't we use this for a scientific outcome? Why don't we use this as a measure? It's already done. We can easily measure it." They just didn't want to hear about it. So
well, I can relate to that because in my department, most professors don't care about it either. They don't measure it. They don't want to know about it. They don't want to know what you're doing. Jeff Phillips and I, and Feruzan, when she was with us, was one. We've got 2 new faculty members, so I'm hoping that they'll be more open. But out of about 7 or 8 faculty members, there's only 2 of us that definitely use it. But that's life. You can do it on your own. You don't have to have a whole department doing it unless somebody somehow is controlling you that way.
Well, we did it, and we did publish it, so it was kind of fun to see that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Could you send me what you published?
Yeah. I put the link in the chat, but I'll send it to you.
Yes.
Thank you.
So Professor Coletta, there have been a few of our participants who had to leave. Some of them were still teaching, and they left thank you notes in the chat for you. I do have one final question, maybe to conclude, unless anybody else has any other questions.
I have a question.
Oh, great.
Do you want to go first? Or?
Okay, so I'll go first with mine. All right, so if we're using the Lawson's test and finding that a lot of our students say have low scores in reasoning abilities, what to do to remediate that? Moving on, what can we do during the semester then to remediate that? Because as I understand in your papers, it's 2 separate things. The learning of physics and the conceptual physics that they will need, they will be tested on in the FCI, and that they will not properly absorb that if they also don't have proper reasoning abilities already. Yeah. So we need to strengthen the reasoning abilities in parallel as teaching the physics then.
Yeah, well, I think a number of things, and they're covered in my book, Thinking in Physics, but I'll just mention like the Fierstein dots. If the problem is the student is very impulsive, maybe it's just impulsiveness. Training can help them get over that. If it's working memories, the ability to hold ideas in working memory and to work and manipulate things is an important element of all kinds of reasoning. And the kickbox games developed by Matthew Peterson. And if I had more time, I'd tell you about the wonderful things he's doing in elementary education. Fortunately, he lives close to me, so I've had some good interactions with him. Now, that's no longer available on my website because Adobe killed Flash, and so it's not working. But I'm in communication with him, trying to get the new version of that. Tutoring, identifying the students. Now, you may have a much larger group of students, and maybe it's going to be harder to identify, but maybe you need to develop more time. So for me, it's a subset of students. It's 10 or 20%. For you, it may be a much larger set. In that case, I would say much more attention needs to be paid to developing the reasoning ability, rather than just going on and on with the physics that they're not completely capable of absorbing. Mm-hmm. I don't know if that answers your question.
I've always thought that liberal arts courses should develop that fundamental reasoning in the first place and not be so content heavy, but that seems to have changed over the last couple of decades. It's now you've got to turn them into little astronomers or little physicists, and that reasoning, which we want them to have, it's never explicitly taught. I mean, Arnold Ahrens drilled this into the ground. It's just like everybody ignores it. Yeah, and those of us who try to bring that back, we're sort of shouted out by the people who say, no, you must cover 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. And I'm sorry.
Joe, I couldn't agree with you more. You know, there are forces of reason and then there's forces of unreason. And climate change is a good example of that. I'm assuming everyone here is a believer in climate change and human effects of the causes of climate change. But there's a huge number of people in society who just deny it or deny that it's related to human activity. But that is changing. Yeah, I've just noticed in the last few years, there's so much more. There was something that came out the other day where shareholders are holding accountable gasoline companies like Exxon for the damage they do to the environment and therefore exacerbating climate change. I think I tend to be very much an optimist. So no matter how bad things are, there's things that we can do. And we can get out there and promote these things to other people. And if they hear it coming from enough different directions, maybe, just maybe they will start to listen.
Thank you. Negusi.
Yeah, thank you. So I know you mentioned different clicker questions, games, and these are, I'm assuming, for conceptual physics courses. Can you describe?
No, this is for a regular physics course.
Oh, regular physics.
These are extra activities, not something that we do in class, but something that they have an opportunity to do outside of class, in some cases for extra credit. I don't remember exactly how I handle all of them, but they're not in-class activities.
Oh, they're not in class. That was what I was going to ask you. Are they, how you fit in, what, if you could describe your class, if these were incorporated, and you answered that one. So the other question I have is, what is the content of the 15 minutes interview you do? General things or?
It's very open-ended. It's based, first of all, on the assessment I've already done of their reasoning ability and their FCI, you know, loss in FCI, attitudes and beliefs, anxiety, stuff like that. So I already have that. I have a sheet of paper with all of the results of that on it. And also their first thinking journal, in which I asked them just to tell me something about themselves. And some of them tell me virtually nothing, but others tell me really interesting things like I'm a pilot or I've done this or that. And then also their goals for themselves in the course, their objectives. So there's lots to talk about when I come to them, and I share some of these things from assessment with them. And then I strike up a conversation. So they get to know me and I get to know them. That's the objective. And also I tell them it's because I want them to be comfortable coming to my office. So I require this. It's not like it's optional. You all have to do this. There's a sign-up sheet. Sign up for 15 minutes over the next 2 days, and they all do. Nobody has ever objected to that. Strangely enough, they all do it.
Great.
I've done something very similar, and I found that buy-in was much greater during the Zoom era than in the time of brick and mortar office hours.
The other one is, what are you trying to learn from when you try to measure impulsiveness, and how do you use that? What are you trying to get?
Well, it's their ability, the scores on these connect the dots things. How many do they get right? How many do they get wrong? And there's a whole series of these, and they get progressively harder. And I collect these and look at these, and many students do very, very well, and other students it's just like, oh my God, you don't have any idea. This is a triangle and you're showing a square or something. And it's just that they want to get through it quickly. I think this is a measure largely of impulsiveness. And Reuven Fierstein, who initiated this, did it as an aid to students that were mentally challenged that, that were not normal. And he found that this really helped. This impulsiveness was a feature of their lack of ability. Now, my students are not mentally challenged. They don't have that disability, but they do vary in their abilities to focus on things and in their impulsiveness. And so that is one of the many things I try to measure and address. And I'd be happy to share any of these materials with any of you.
Thank you.
That would be great. I have a question. In terms of time, you were sharing the data from that high school teacher.
Yeah.
And I was just thinking that if I'm not mistaken, for a high school is 180 days by law. So usually high schools have 1 hour a day. So if you add it up, I think they have more time in class, in physics class, than they do at a normal, university or community college. So I was wondering if that has ever been looked at as a factor. I don't even know how many. I think there's a difference between all of us of how many hours a week, do we offer our classes, and whether there has been any studies done on the effect of time.
No, we haven't done any real studies of that. But in response to your question, I can tell you that when I first started working with Jeff Steinert, it was right after we published the 2005 paper. He responded to that, and he already had all sorts of data to share with us. And so it was really interesting. And then when we began to study the Lawson scores that he had versus what we had and the gains that he had, his results were very similar to ours. This is a suburban high school, and then he went to Arizona not too many years ago, simply because one of his children was a musician and he wanted to go to an art school. So he became a teacher at Arizona School for the Arts. And he contacted me and he said, "Oh my God, I am shocked. My students here do so much better on the FCI. Their gains are better. And I don't know what it is, because it's not that their Lawson scores are better. It's just that there's something about the culture." And we've never published anything on this because it's still a mystery to us. But somehow maybe the culture of excellence, I don't know. It's sort of an elite school. And if you look at the data from Arizona's School of the Arts, those gains are really off the charts, much greater than the gains at Edward Little High School, where he taught formally, or at LMU. So I don't know if that answered your questions, but the amount of time, I think, I'm not sure of this, but I think it was the same in Arizona as it was in Maine.
Thank you.
Any other question, Professor Coletta? We are at 5:18 p.m.
Yes, and I apologize for taking so long, but I'm very happy that you had so many questions.
Yes, exactly. Thank you so much for staying with us all this time. We're very thankful. A lot of people had to leave and thanked you.
Oh, I understand, but it was my pleasure to do this. So thank you for participating.
Thank you for being here.
We'll post this in YouTube, and what normally happens is this is the way people will now know you and connect with you and send you emails directly when they need to learn more about certain.
That's a great idea. I don't know why I've never done that. I actually have my students in their projects upload their presentations to YouTube, but I've never actually done any of my own stuff. So I thank you for doing that.
All right, we are all good. So happy Memorial Day weekend for everyone. Enjoy your time. All the best. Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you all. This has been wonderful.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Goodbye, everyone.
Bye-bye.